October 14th, 1943, 1,147 hours, 28,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, of Jägerschwader, 27, rolled his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 into a shallow dive, his gloved hand steady on the control column, his eyes tracking the formation of American B-17 flying fortresses struggling homeward after their bombing run. The heavy bombers were flying in their characteristic defensive box formation, their 50 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle, but Stigler could see what mattered most. The sky around them was empty. No escort fighters. The American Thunderbolts that had accompanied the bombers to the German border had turned back hours ago, their fuel exhausted, leaving the fortresses naked and vulnerable for the 300-mile gauntlet back to England. Stigler smiled inside his oxygen mask. This was target practice. The Americans called this mission Black Thursday, and they would lose 60 bombers before the day ended. 290 men killed, 550 captured in a slaughter so complete that the 8th Air Force would suspend deep penetration raids for months. As Stigler positioned himself for the attack, selecting a straggling B-17 trailing smoke from its No. 3 engine, he permitted himself a moment of professional satisfaction. The Americans were brave, certainly suicidally brave, but courage without fighter escort was just a complicated form of suicide. The Luftwaffe had won this contest through simple mathematics. American fighters couldn't reach Germany, and bombers without escorts were flying coffins. What Oberleutnant Stigler didn't know, as he lined up his gun sight on that crippled fortress, was that his professional world was about to be annihilated by an aircraft that was, at that precise moment, beginning its deployment to England, an aircraft that would render his tactical calculations obsolete, transform the entire strategic bombing campaign, and systematically destroy the Luftwaffe as a functional fighting force through the application of technology, industrial capacity, and operational range that Germany could neither match nor counter. This wasn't about one aircraft being slightly better than another. This was about the arrival of strategic dominance in the air, the solution to a problem that had seemed mathematically unsolvable, and the physical manifestation of American industrial might transformed into a weapon system so superior in its operational characteristics that it would change the fundamental nature of the air war. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with the British Merlin engine and drop tanks that extended its range to an unprecedented 1,650 miles, was about to escort American bombers all the way to Berlin and back, killing German pilots at a rate that would make October 1943 look like the Luftwaffe's golden age. Stigler was hunting what he thought were defenseless bombers. Within 6 months, he would be the prey, hunted by fighters that could follow him anywhere in the Reich, and whose pilots were being trained and deployed at rates that would overwhelm German replacement capacity through sheer numerical superiority. The strategic bombing campaign that the United States had begun in August 1942 was, by late 1943, failing catastrophically, and everyone involved knew it. The theory had been elegant. American B-17 and B-24 bombers, flying in tight defensive formations at high altitude, would use their combined firepower. Each B-17 carried 13 50-caliber machine guns with interlocking fields of fire to fight their way through German defenses, strike industrial targets deep inside the Reich, and return to England with acceptable losses. The phrase acceptable losses was defined as anything under 10% casualties per mission, a threshold calculated by operations analysts who determined that bomber crews could theoretically complete their required 25 missions before losses made the unit non-operational. The theory was mathematically sound. The reality was carnage. German fighters had systematically shredded this assumption through the ruthless application of tactics that exploited the fundamental vulnerability of even the most heavily armed bomber. It was still just an aluminum tube filled with high-octane aviation fuel and high explosives, and it couldn't maneuver like a fighter. The numbers from 1943 told a story of systematic destruction. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943, targeting ball-bearing factories critical to German war production, cost The 8th Air Force 60 bombers out of 376 dispatched, a 16% loss rate. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th cost 60 more bombers from a force of 291, a 20.6% loss rate. These weren't sustainable casualties. They were annihilation rates. At a 20% loss rate per mission, a bomber crew's chances of surviving 25 missions were statistically zero, not unlikely, but literally mathematically impossible. The 8th Air Force was being destroyed faster than replacement crews and aircraft could arrive from the United States. And German fighter pilots like Stigler were achieving kill ratios that would have been unthinkable in any previous conflict. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots were claiming 5, 10, sometimes 15 kills in a single mission, not through exceptional skill alone, but because they were engaging targets that had exhausted their fighter escort and were desperately trying to survive through defensive firepower that, while impressive, couldn't compensate for the ability to choose the time, place, and angle of attack. The problem was range. American escort fighters in 1943 were limited by fuel capacity that restricted their operational radius to perhaps 200 miles from base, barely enough to reach the German border before having to turn back. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a superb fighter in its own right, heavily armed and nearly indestructible, could escort bombers to the edge of Germany, and that was all. The P-38 Lightning had better range but was complex, expensive, and prone to engine problems at high altitude. Neither aircraft could accompany bombers to targets like Schweinfurt or Berlin, or the oil refineries in Silesia that were critical to the German war effort. This meant that bomber formations were protected for perhaps the first hour of their mission and the last hour of their return, but were completely vulnerable during the 3 or 4 hours over enemy territory, giving German fighters a window of opportunity that they exploited with devastating efficiency. The Luftwaffe had organized its fighter forces specifically around this vulnerability, positioning interceptor wings at strategic locations to attack bombers during their most exposed phase, concentrating their forces at times, and places where American escorts couldn't intervene. German fighter tactics had evolved into a brutal science. Pilots like Stigler and his colleagues had developed specialized attack profiles designed to defeat bomber defensive fire through approaches that minimized exposure time while maximizing damage. The head-on attack, approaching from 12 o'clock high and firing until the last possible moment before breaking away, could kill the pilots, destroy the cockpit, and sometimes break the bomber's back with a single cannon burst. The Me-109 and Fy-190 both mounted 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns that could tear through a B-17 structure in ways that 50-caliber defensive guns couldn't match. German fighters also operated in groups, with wingmen providing covering fire while the lead pilot made his attack run. They had learned to ignore the waist gunners and focus on killing bombers quickly, often concentrating fire on a single engine to start a fuel fire that would destroy the aircraft. The most experienced pilots could evaluate a bomber's damage state at a glance and target stragglers' aircraft that had dropped out of formation due to engine damage, wounded crew, or hydraulic failure, which were effectively defenseless and could be destroyed with near impunity. The loss rates created a psychological crisis in the bomber squadrons that was, in some ways, more damaging than the material losses. Bomber crews were calculating their survival odds and arriving at conclusions that made continued operations a form of sanctioned suicide. A crew that survived 5 missions knew they had 20 more to go, and at current loss rates, simple arithmetic said they wouldn't make it. This knowledge affected morale, performance, and recruitment. The 8th Air Force was simultaneously losing experienced crews while finding it increasingly difficult to replace them with fresh crews who were, inevitably, less experienced and more likely to make fatal mistakes. The entire strategic bombing campaign, the cornerstone of American and British air strategy in Europe, was spiraling toward irrelevance because the technology and tactics of 1943 couldn't solve the fundamental problem of getting bombers to their targets and back again. Then came the P-51 Mustang, and everything changed. Not immediately. Nothing in war changes immediately, but with an inexorable logic that transformed the strategic situation over the course of 6 months. The Mustang's development history was itself a demonstration of Allied industrial and technical advantages. Originally designed in 1940 by North American Aviation in response to a British requirement, the early P-51 had been a decent low-altitude fighter powered by an Allison engine, but nothing exceptional at the high altitudes where bomber escort work happened. British engineers, recognizing the airframe's potential, mated it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a brilliant piece of engineering that provided exceptional, high-altitude performance, creating the P-51B variant that entered service in late 1943. The P-51D, which would become the iconic version, followed in 1944 with a bubble canopy that provided 360-degree visibility and 6 .50-caliber machine guns that gave it devastating firepower. But the Mustang's revolutionary characteristic wasn't its speed. It was fast, but not dramatically faster than late-model Me 109 seconds or F1 190 seconds or its maneuverability, though it handled beautifully. The revolution was range. With external drop tanks, disposable fuel tanks mounted under the wings that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat was joined, the P-51D could escort bombers for 1,650 miles from base. This meant a Mustang taking off from England could fly to Berlin, engage in combat for 20 minutes, and still have fuel to return home. It was a capability that simply didn't exist in the German arsenal and couldn't be developed within the time frame that mattered. German fighters were designed for short-range interception, operating close to their bases with fuel loads optimized for combat performance rather than endurance. The FW-190 had a combat radius of perhaps 300 miles. The Me-109G might reach 350 miles under optimal conditions. Neither could match the Mustang's range, even without considering that German pilots were increasingly flying from bases inside Germany itself, giving up territory for defense in depth, but also lengthening their interception routes. The strategic implication was devastating. There was now nowhere in the Reich that was beyond the reach of American escort fighters. Every synthetic oil plant, every ball-bearing factory, every aircraft assembly facility could be attacked by formations of bombers protected by fighters that could dogfight German interceptors on equal or better terms, and could stay in the fight all the way to the target and all the way home. The first major deep escort mission using P-51 seconds in significant numbers occurred on March 6, 1944, when the 8th Air Force dispatched 730 bombers to Berlin escorted by 796 fighters, including several groups of Mustangs. This was no longer the vulnerable bomber streams of 1,943. This was an armada with teeth, fighters swarming above, beside, and below the bombers in numbers that made German tactical calculations obsolete. German controllers watching their radar screens saw the massive formation approaching and vectored fighter wings to intercept, expecting the familiar pattern. Hit the bombers after the escorts turned back. Except the escorts didn't turn back. They kept coming. Past Hanover, past Brunswick, all the way to Berlin, where they engaged German fighters over the Reich capital itself, a psychological blow that was almost as significant as the operational one. German pilots, who had become accustomed to choosing when and where to fight, were now forced into combat whether they liked it or not, and forced to fight not just to kill bombers, but to simply survive encounters with fighters that were present in overwhelming numbers. The loss rates tell the story with brutal clarity. In the first quarter of 1944, before long-range escort became standard, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at rates between 4 and 10% per mission, with some missions far higher. After March 1944, with P-51 seconds providing comprehensive escort, loss rates dropped to 2 to 3% for most missions. This was still costly. 2% losses on a mission involving 1,000 bombers meant 20 aircraft and 200 men, but it was sustainable in ways that 10% wasn't. More critically, German losses increased dramatically. In February 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 33.8% of its single-engine fighter pilots killed, captured, or wounded, so severely they couldn't return to combat. In March, the number climbed to 56%. In April, it reached 43%. These weren't sustainable losses for Germany. These were annihilation rates. The systematic destruction of an Air Force's most valuable resource, experienced pilots, at a tempo that replacement training couldn't match. The mathematics of pilot production revealed a disparity that made the aircraft production numbers look almost reasonable by comparison. The United States was training approximately 250,000 pilots during the war, with the training program running continuously throughout the conflict. American fighter pilots received, on average, 400 hours of flight training before their first combat mission, 200 hours in basic flight training, 100 hours in advanced single-engine training, and another 100 hours in operational training units flying the actual aircraft they'd take into combat. This training was comprehensive, expensive, and time-consuming, but it produced pilots who could fly and fight effectively from their first mission. German pilot training, by contrast, was collapsing. In 1942, German pilots might receive 200 to 250 hours of training. By 1944, this had fallen to 160 hours. By late 1944, some pilots were entering combat with 50 hours or less, often having never fired their guns in practice or practiced formation flying with experienced squadrons. These pilots weren't inherently less capable than their American counterparts, but they were being fed into a meat grinder with insufficient preparation, and they died at rates that reflected this inadequate training. The production numbers for the P-51 Mustang demonstrate the industrial chasm that separated American capabilities from German ones. North American aviation produced 15,586 P-51 seconds of all variants between 1,940 and 1,945, with peak production reaching 16 aircraft per day, one Mustang rolling off the production line every 90 minutes at the height of production. These weren't handcrafted machines built by specialized technicians. They were mass-produced weapons built on assembly lines using techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing, with standardized parts that could be installed by semi-skilled workers who had been trained for weeks rather than years. The entire manufacturing process had been optimized for speed and scale rather than for individual quality, though quality control remained high by the standards of mass production. North American Aviation's Inglewood plant employed 91,000 workers at peak production, many of them women who had entered the workforce to replace men drafted for military service. These workers were producing not just Mustangs but also B-25 Mitchell bombers, training aircraft, and components for other manufacturers, demonstrating an industrial flexibility that Germany couldn't match. German fighter production, by comparison, was impressive in absolute numbers, but inadequate relative to losses and hopelessly outmatched by Allied production. Germany produced approximately 25,000 fighters in 1944, Me, 109 seconds, Foix, 190 seconds, and the new Me-262 jet fighter. This sounds substantial until you compare it to combined Allied fighter production that same year. The United States alone built 38,000 fighters, while Britain produced another 10,000. The Allies were outproducing Germany in fighters at a ratio of nearly 2-to-1, while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of bombers, transport aircraft, and trainers. And unlike Germany, which was seeing its production increasingly disrupted by Allied bombing, Allied aircraft factories operated with minimal interference, their output constrained only by material availability and labor, rather than by enemy action. American factories could plan production runs months in advance with reasonable confidence that the factory would still be standing when those plans came to fruition. German factories were being bombed systematically, forcing dispersal of production into smaller, less efficient facilities that couldn't achieve the economies of scale that made mass production effective. The P-51's operational characteristics created tactical situations that German pilots found increasingly impossible to handle. The Mustang wasn't just escorting bombers anymore, it was hunting German fighters. American doctrine evolved to take advantage of the Mustang's range and numbers. Some fighters stayed tight with the bombers to provide immediate protection, but others ranged ahead and to the sides, looking for German fighters before they could organize their attacks. This fighter sweep tactic forced German pilots into a dilemma. They could try to avoid the sweeping Mustangs and attack the bombers, risking being bounced from above by fighters they hadn't seen, or they could engage the Mustangs directly, which meant burning fuel and ammunition in fighter versus fighter combat before they ever reached the bombers. Either way, the German pilot's ability to conduct a controlled interception on his terms had been compromised. He was now fighting a defensive battle in his own airspace, and defensive battles favor the side with numerical superiority and operational flexibility. The Mustang's performance envelope was so well matched to its mission that it seemed almost purpose-built for the strategic bombing campaign. Though this was largely coincidence, the aircraft had been designed before its role as a long-range escort fighter had been fully conceptualized. It could cruise economically at high altitude, conserving fuel while maintaining formation with the bombers. When combat was joined, it could accelerate rapidly and fight at any altitude from sea level to 40,000 feet with exceptional performance. Its controls remained light and responsive throughout its speed range, giving pilots fine control during the demanding task of dogfighting. It could outdive almost any German fighter critical for breaking contact when necessary. It could turn with a Me-109 and had superior high-altitude performance compared to the FY-190 Amperes. The FY-190D, introduced in late 1944, was arguably superior to the P-51 in some respects, but by then the numerical disparity was so overwhelming that individual aircraft performance advantages made little practical difference. German pilots' accounts from 1944 reveal a growing sense of futility and desperation that stands in stark contrast to the confident professionalism of 1943. Major Heinz Baer, a highly decorated ace with over 200 victories, described a mission in March 1944 where his unit intercepted a bomber formation. "We saw the fortresses at once, but we also saw the fighters, swarms of them, above, below, everywhere. We had perhaps 40 aircraft. They had hundreds. We made our attack, and I shot down one bomber, but immediately there were 3 Mustangs on my tail, and I had to break off. My wingman was hit and went down. We landed having lost 5 pilots for 3 bombers destroyed. The mathematics no longer work. We cannot win this way." This wasn't defeatism, it was rational assessment. The veteran German pilot was calculating kill ratios and realizing that German fighters were being lost faster than they could be replaced, while American losses, though substantial, were sustainable given replacement rates. The fuel situation compounded German difficulties in ways that were less immediately visible but ultimately just as decisive as the numerical disparity in aircraft and pilots. Germany's aviation fuel production had been targeted systematically by Allied bombers starting in May 1944 as part of the oil plan, the strategic decision to prioritize petroleum infrastructure over all other targets. The results were catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. German aviation fuel production in March 1944 was 181,000 tons. By September 1944, after sustained bombing of synthetic fuel plants, production had fallen to 17,000 tons, a 90% reduction in 6 months. This meant that German fighters couldn't fly as many sorties, couldn't train new pilots adequately, and couldn't intercept every bomber formation even when they wanted to. Meanwhile, American fuel production was measured not in thousands of tons but in tens of millions of tons annually. With such abundant availability, that fuel conservation was barely a consideration in American operations planning. P-51 pilots could afford to use combat power settings liberally, could engage in extended dogfights, could make multiple attack passes, secure in the knowledge that fuel was available for whatever the mission required. The attrition of German fighter pilots was not just a matter of combat losses, though those were severe. It was a systemic collapse of the pilot production and sustainment system under pressures that accumulated from multiple directions simultaneously. New pilots entering combat with inadequate training died quickly, often on their first or second mission, before they had learned the survival skills that veterans possessed. The death of these replacement pilots meant that veteran pilots had to fly more missions to compensate, which exposed them to additional risk and eventually led to their loss as well. As the veteran cadre eroded, squadron effectiveness declined because there were fewer experienced pilots to mentor replacements and fewer skilled leaders to direct tactical engagements. This created a negative feedback loop where declining effectiveness led to higher losses, which led to further decline in effectiveness, accelerating the Luftwaffe's disintegration. By late 1944, some German fighter units were combat ineffective, not because they lacked aircraft, though that was increasingly a problem, but because they lacked pilots capable of flying them effectively. The introduction of the Me-262 jet fighter in late 1944 demonstrated both German technical capability and the futility of technological solutions to systemic problems. The Me-262 was genuinely revolutionary, the world's first operational jet fighter, with a top speed of 540 miles per hour that made it substantially faster than any Allied piston-engine fighter. In competent hands, it was nearly untouchable, able to attack bombers and escape before escorts could react. But Germany could only produce about 1,400 Me-262 seconds before the war ended, and only a fraction of these ever saw combat due to chronic shortages of fuel, spare parts, and trained jet pilots. More critically, the Me-262's bases were known to Allied intelligence, and P-51 seconds learned to patrol near these bases, attacking Me-262 seconds during their most vulnerable phases takeoff and landing, when the jet's speed advantage was nullified. The Germans had produced a technologically superior fighter but couldn't deploy it in numbers that mattered, couldn't protect it adequately on the ground, and couldn't fuel it sufficiently for sustained operations. It was a weapon system defeated not by superior Allied technology, but by superior Allied logistics and operational tempo. The long-range escort missions flown by P-51 seconds in 1944 and 1945 weren't just protecting bombers, they were systematically destroying the Luftwaffe as an institution. American fighter pilots were racking up kill ratios that would have seemed fantastical in previous conflicts. The leading American ace in Europe, Major Richard Bong, had 40 victories. Multiple pilots achieved 20, 30, or more kills. And these numbers weren't just statistical achievements, they represented German pilots and aircraft permanently removed from the war. Each German fighter destroyed was a fighter that couldn't intercept the next bomber stream. Each German pilot killed was a pilot who wouldn't train the next generation of replacements. The cumulative effect was the erosion of the Luftwaffe's combat power, at a rate that exceeded every possible replacement mechanism. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe's fighter force existed primarily on paper. There were aircraft, but they sat grounded for lack of fuel, or they were flown by pilots with inadequate training, or they were husbanded for a decisive battle that never came because German commanders recognized that committing their remaining forces would simply result in their destruction without meaningfully affecting the strategic situation. The bomber campaign that the P-51 enabled inflicted damage on German war production that was substantial but less than Allied planners had hoped. German industrial output actually increased through 1944, despite sustained bombing, a testament to German organizational ability and the decentralization of production. But this obscures the counterfactual. What German production would have been without the bombing? German factories were dispersed into smaller facilities, which reduced efficiency. Workers spent time in air raid shelters rather than on production lines. Transportation networks were disrupted, creating bottlenecks that prevented optimal factory utilization. Critical materials like ball bearings and aviation fuel were produced in insufficient quantities. The bombing campaign didn't collapse German industry, but it degraded it, limited it, and prevented it from reaching the production levels that would have been necessary to match Allied output. And this degradation was only possible because the bombers could reach their targets, which was only possible because the P-51 Mustang could escort them there and back. The psychological impact of long-range escort cannot be quantified precisely, but was perhaps as important as the material impact. German civilians, German soldiers, and German leadership could see American bombers flying over Germany at will, protected by fighters that seemed to be everywhere, dropping bombs with increasing accuracy, and suffering losses that, while significant, didn't prevent the next raid, and the next, and the next. This visible demonstration of Allied air superiority undermined morale and confirmed what the numbers already showed. Germany was losing the war. The sight of vapor trails stretching across German skies, bombers heading to target, Fighters weaving above them became so common that it was unremarkable, a normal part of life under total war. This normalization of Allied air presence was itself a kind of defeat, the acknowledgement that Germany could no longer contest its own airspace effectively, and that the end was simply a matter of time. In June 1944, 8 months after Oberleutnant Stigler had attacked those unescorted B-17 seconds over Schweinfurt, the strategic situation had inverted completely. American bombers were now conducting maximum effort raids, with losses typically below 2%. German fighter pilots were being killed at rates approaching 50% per month. The Luftwaffe was losing approximately 1,000 pilots per month to combat and accidents, while training schools were producing perhaps 800 replacement pilots, whose inadequate preparation virtually guaranteed their rapid loss. The industrial production gap had widened to the point where the United States alone was producing more fighters each month than Germany's entire operational fighter inventory. The mathematics that had favored Germany in 1943, where German fighters could destroy unescorted bombers at favorable exchange ratios, had been completely reversed. Now American fighters were destroying German fighters at exchange ratios that made every engagement a German defeat, regardless of the tactical outcome. Major Heinz Baer flew throughout this period, surviving missions that killed most of his colleagues, and in a diary entry from August 1944, recently recovered from German archives, he captured the essential futility with terrible clarity. "We are no longer fighting a war, we are being systematically exterminated. The Americans come every day. We intercept when we have fuel, which is perhaps 3 days of 7. When we do engage, there are always more of them than us. 5 to 1, 10 to 1, sometimes more. I shot down 2 Mustangs yesterday and felt no satisfaction, only relief that I survived. My wingman did not. He was 20 years old and had 40 hours in type. He died because he didn't know to check his 6 o'clock before engaging. In 1942, I could have trained him properly. Now there is no time, no fuel for training flights. Only combat missions until he dies. We cannot win. The question is only how long until there are no pilots left." That diary entry, stark and unvarnished, represents the ultimate validation of the strategic transformation that the P-51 Mustang enabled. It's easy to focus on the aircraft itself, the elegant lines, the bubble canopy, the Merlin engine's distinctive sound, and miss the larger truth that the Mustang represented. The aircraft was superbly engineered, but what made it decisive wasn't its engineering. It was the industrial and logistical system that could produce 15,586 of them in 4 years, that could train tens of thousands of pilots to fly them, that could transport them across the Atlantic, that could fuel them, arm them, maintain them, and put them over Berlin every day regardless of losses or weather or German defenses. The Mustang was a weapon system in the truest sense, not just a machine but an integrated combination of technology, training, logistics, and industrial capacity that Germany could observe, analyze, and understand but could not counter, because the solution required resources Germany no longer possessed. The doctrinal implications were profound and continue to shape air power theory. The P-51 proved that strategic bombing could work if and only if the bombers were escorted all the way to target by fighters that could engage enemy interceptors on equal or better terms. This sounds obvious in retrospect, but it wasn't obvious in 1942 when the bombing campaign began. The prevailing theory had been that bombers could defend themselves through concentrated firepower. This theory was tested against German fighters and found catastrophically inadequate. The P-51 didn't just solve a tactical problem, it validated an entire strategic concept that had been in doubt. It demonstrated that with the right technology and sufficient resources, an air force could achieve the kind of sustained air superiority that allowed strategic bombing to function as its theorists had envisioned. This lesson would inform air power doctrine for the rest of the 20th century, and beyond that, control of the air is a prerequisite for everything else. And that control requires not just good aircraft, but the industrial depth to produce them in decisive numbers. The production history of the P-51 reveals another critical advantage that's less often discussed. The aircraft was relatively simple to manufacture compared to German fighters. It used a minimal number of strategic materials, relied on manufacturing techniques that could be executed by semi-skilled workers, and was designed from the start for mass production. German fighters, by contrast, were often engineering marvels that required skilled craftsmanship and materials that became increasingly scarce as the war progressed. The FW-190, for instance, used a complex BMW radial engine that required precision machining and high-grade metals. The Me-109's design dated to the mid-1930s and had been continually modified with more powerful engines and heavier armament, each change adding weight and complexity that degraded the original design's elegant simplicity. These weren't bad aircraft. Both were formidable weapons in skilled hands, but they were harder to produce in quantity, harder to maintain in field conditions, and more sensitive to material shortages that increasingly plagued German industry. The strategic bombing campaign reached its crescendo in early 1945, with missions involving over 1,000 bombers escorted by similar numbers of fighters, conducting what were essentially aerial sieges of German industrial centers. These missions were so large, so comprehensive, and so thoroughly protected that German opposition became sporadic and ineffective. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, still had aircraft and pilots, but it had been defeated as a fighting force through attrition that exceeded every possible replacement rate. The final missions of the war saw American bombers attacking targets with near impunity, facing anti-aircraft fire but minimal fighter opposition because the Luftwaffe could no longer contest the air in meaningful numbers. This wasn't because German pilots had lost their courage or skill, the few who flew fought as tenaciously as ever, but because there simply weren't enough of them, flying aircraft without adequate fuel, against opponents present in overwhelming strength. The irony of the strategic bombing campaign is that its ultimate success came not from the destruction of German industry, which proved remarkably resilient, but from the destruction of the Luftwaffe itself. The bomber offensive forced Germany to commit massive resources to air defense, fighters, pilots, anti-aircraft guns, radar systems, and the industrial capacity to produce all of it. These resources were diverted from other uses, notably from the Eastern Front, where they might have affected the Soviet advance. More critically, the campaign to defend German airspace consumed the Luftwaffe's fighter arm in an attritional struggle it couldn't win. By forcing Germany to fight an air war over its own territory, the Allies ensured that every combat occurred under conditions that favored Allied replacement capacity over German sustainability. The P-51 Mustang was the weapon that made this possible, and in that sense, it might be argued that the Mustang's primary contribution wasn't escorting bombers, but killing German fighters in numbers that depleted the Luftwaffe beyond recovery. The comparison between October 1943 and October 1944 illustrates the transformation with brutal arithmetic. In October 1943, during the Black Thursday raid on Schweinfurt, 291 bombers attacked, defended by inadequate short-range escort, and 60 were lost, 20.6%. German fighters dominated the battle, choosing their attacks at will against bombers that could only huddle in formation and hope their defensive fire would be sufficient. It wasn't. In October 1944, the 8th Air Force dispatched multiple thousand bomber raids deep into Germany, escorted by P-51 seconds all the way to target and back, and typical loss rates were 1 to 2%. German fighters that attempted to intercept were engaged by American escorts before they reached the bombers, or were forced to attack through a gauntlet of fighters that inflicted prohibitive losses. The tactical situation had inverted completely from German fighters hunting defenseless bombers to German fighters being hunted by American fighters while trying to reach the bombers. The personal cost of this transformation was borne by the men who flew these missions, on both sides. American bomber crews who survived the unescorted raids of 1943 and flew again in 1944 reported profound relief at having fighter escort all the way to target. Knowing that P-51 seconds were above them, scanning for threats made the mission psychologically bearable in ways that the naked vulnerability of 1943 had not been. German fighter pilots experienced the opposite trajectory from the confidence of 1943, when they were winning, to the grinding desperation of 1944, to 1,945, when every mission might be their last, and victory was defined merely as survival. These weren't abstract strategic calculations. They were lived experiences of men who understood that they were participants in an attritional struggle, where their individual skill and courage mattered less with each passing month, as the systemic advantages accumulated by one side overwhelmed the other. By war's end, the P-51 Mustang had flown more than 200,000 combat sorties over Europe, destroyed approximately 4,950 enemy aircraft in the air, and another 4,131 on the ground, and established itself as arguably the most important fighter aircraft of the war in Europe. These numbers obscure the operational reality they represent. Tens of thousands of missions where bombers reached their targets and returned because fighters were present to protect them. Thousands of engagements where German fighters were destroyed or driven off. Hundreds of ground attack missions targeting German airfields, locomotives, and military columns. The cumulative effect was the establishment of Allied air supremacy, not just air superiority, which implies contested airspace, but supremacy, which implies the ability to operate at will while denying the same capability to the enemy. This air supremacy enabled the successful execution of the Normandy invasion, supported the ground campaigns across France and Germany, and contributed to the systematic collapse of German military effectiveness in the war's final year. The industrial story behind the P-51 deserves emphasis, because it explains why Germany couldn't develop an effective counter. American aircraft manufacturers were operating with access to virtually unlimited supplies of aluminum, steel, rubber, and petroleum products. North American aviation could order materials months in advance, with confidence they would arrive on schedule. Workers were well-fed, well-paid, and working in factories that weren't being bombed. The electricity ran continuously. Transportation networks functioned normally. This allowed optimization of production processes, investment in tooling and facilities, and the kind of systematic improvement that yields dramatic efficiency gains over time. German aircraft production, by contrast, was operating under conditions of increasing chaos. Materials were scarce and arriving unpredictably. Factories were being dispersed to avoid bombing, which degraded efficiency. Skilled workers were being drafted for military service. Transportation was disrupted. Power was unreliable. Under these conditions, maintaining production levels required heroic effort. Improving them was virtually impossible. The P-51's development timeline also reveals Allied advantages in technical innovation and practical application. The aircraft's basic design was completed in 1940, but the marriage with the Merlin engine that created the truly effective version didn't occur until 1942, and the P-51B didn't reach combat squadrons in significant numbers until late 1943. This 3-year development cycle sounds slow, but it represented a systematic process of design, testing, refinement, pilot training, and operational deployment that produced a mature weapon system rather than a rushed prototype. Germany's Me-262 jet fighter, by contrast, first flew in 1942, but didn't enter combat in meaningful numbers until 1944, and even then suffered from reliability problems and operational limitations that prevented it from achieving its theoretical potential. The Germans had the technology earlier but couldn't translate that technological advantage into operational capability because the supporting infrastructure, fuel, parts, trained pilots, secure bases was inadequate or absent. The psychological dimension of the P-51's impact extended beyond pilots to civilians and leadership. German civilians watching American bombers overhead, protected by fighters that often bore kill markings, indicating dozens of German aircraft destroyed, understood viscerally that Germany was losing. This wasn't propaganda, it was observable reality. German military leadership, receiving daily reports of pilot losses and aircraft destroyed, could calculate that the attrition mathematics made continued resistance futile, but were trapped by political realities that prevented rational assessment from translating into policy. Hitler's insistence on continued resistance despite overwhelming evidence of impending defeat meant that resources were consumed and lives were lost for months after the outcome was mathematically certain. The P-51 and the broader Allied air campaign didn't just defeat Germany militarily, they made that defeat so visible and undeniable that it became impossible to ignore even within the propaganda-saturated environment of Nazi Germany. The escort missions over Berlin hold particular symbolic significance. Berlin was the Reich capital, the political and psychological center of Nazi Germany, located deep inside German territory and heavily defended by both fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. The fact that American bombers could reach Berlin in daylight, drop their bombs, and return to England, not once as a dramatic gesture, but repeatedly as a routine operation, represented a fundamental breakdown in German air defense and a propaganda disaster that no amount of spin could minimize. German civilians experienced air raid sirens daily, watched their cities burn, and understood that their government could neither prevent these attacks nor meaningfully retaliate against the enemies conducting them. This psychological defeat complemented and perhaps exceeded the material damage inflicted by the bombing itself. The comparative training systems for fighter pilots reveal perhaps the starkest disparity. An American fighter pilot in 1944 would begin with basic flight training, learning to fly in stable, forgiving trainer aircraft under the supervision of experienced instructors. He would then progress to advanced single-engine training, flying higher performance aircraft and learning combat maneuvers, gunnery, and tactical formation flying. Finally, he would attend operational training units where he'd fly the actual aircraft type he'd take into combat, often receiving instruction from combat veterans who had rotated back to training duties. This pilot would arrive in his squadron with 400+ hours of experience, comfortable with his aircraft, familiar with tactical procedures, and physically and mentally prepared for combat. A German fighter pilot in 1944 might receive 50 to 100 hours of training total, often flying obsolescent trainers with inadequate fuel for comprehensive instruction, taught by instructors who were themselves inexperienced, and arriving at his squadron never having fired his guns or practiced formation combat. This pilot was being sent to die, and the Luftwaffe's leadership knew it, but the system had collapsed to the point where even inadequately trained pilots were preferable to no pilots at all. The operational flexibility that comprehensive escort provided transformed how the strategic bombing campaign functioned. Early in the campaign, target selection was constrained by range. Only targets within unescorted distance could be attacked without accepting catastrophic losses. With P-51 escort available, target selection became purely a matter of strategic priority rather than operational feasibility. Oil refineries in Silesia, aircraft factories in Bavaria, transportation hubs in eastern Germany, all became viable targets because the bombers could get there and back. This forced Germany to defend everywhere, which meant they could defend nowhere effectively. Air defense resources had to be spread across the entire Reich rather than concentrated at likely target areas, diluting their effectiveness and making every defensive measure less efficient. The P-51's range effectively multiplied the effect of Allied bombing by preventing Germany from adopting a defense-in-depth strategy that might have been viable against shorter-range escorts. Looking at the final statistics from the air war over Europe, the scale of Allied victory becomes undeniable. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 70,000 aircraft destroyed in combat or accidents during the war, not damaged, not repairable, but completely destroyed. The Allies lost roughly 40,000 aircraft in Europe, though the distribution of these losses was heavily skewed toward the early years of the war. German pilot losses exceeded 50,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The 8th Air Force alone flew 1.7 million sorties and dropped 700,000 tons of bombs on European targets. These numbers represent sustained operations at a tempo that Germany couldn't match, enabled by industrial capacity that Germany couldn't replicate, supported by logistics that Germany couldn't disrupt. The P-51 Mustang was the weapon system that made this sustainment possible by solving the escort problem that had threatened to make strategic bombing non-viable. The legacy of the P-51's military aviation extends far beyond its immediate wartime achievements. It established that long-range escort fighters were not just desirable but essential for strategic bombing to function. It proved that range could be as important as performance in determining combat effectiveness. It demonstrated that mass production of moderately complex, highly reliable aircraft could defeat smaller numbers of more sophisticated designs. These lessons informed jet fighter development in the post-war era and continue to influence aircraft design today. Modern air forces universally recognize that achieving air superiority requires fighters that can sustain operations wherever bombers or strike aircraft need to go, and this recognition traces directly to the lessons learned when P-51 seconds began escorting bombers to Berlin. The human dimension of this story deserves final emphasis. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, who attacked those B-17 seconds in October 1943, survived the war. In later interviews, he described the psychological transition from confidence to desperation that German pilots experienced as the P-51 seconds proliferated. In 1943, we felt we were winning, he recalled. The Americans were brave, but they were dying in numbers that couldn't be sustained. Then came the Mustangs. At first just a few, then more, then everywhere. By mid-1944, every mission was survival. We weren't hunting bombers anymore. We were being hunted. The Americans could be everywhere, could follow us to our bases, could engage us whenever they chose. We had lost control of our own sky. He survived by luck and skill in approximately equal measure, flying missions until the war's end, despite knowing that each flight might be his last. His experience, repeated across thousands of German pilots, represents the human cost of strategic miscalculation and industrial inadequacy. In the final analysis, the P-51 Mustang didn't just escort bombers to Berlin, it destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force, enabled the strategic bombing campaign to achieve its objectives, and demonstrated with undeniable clarity that industrial capacity would determine the outcome of modern warfare, as surely as battlefield prowess had determined ancient conflicts. German pilots in October 1943 laughed at unescorted American bombers because they were winning that tactical engagement and could reasonably expect to continue winning it. 6 months later, those same pilots were flying outnumbered, outproduced, and outmatched missions, with no expectation of victory and minimal hope of survival. The transformation wasn't gradual or ambiguous. It was sudden, comprehensive, and irreversible, a demonstration of how quickly strategic situations can invert when one side solves a critical technological problem while possessing the industrial capacity to exploit that solution at scale. The sky over Germany, which had belonged to the Luftwaffe in 1943, belonged completely to the Allies by 1944, and the P-51 Mustang was the weapon that claimed it. German pilots stopped laughing, not because they lost their sense of humor, but because they were being systematically exterminated by an opponent they could no longer defeat, flying aircraft they couldn't match, in numbers they couldn't counter, supported by an industrial system they couldn't comprehend, and certainly couldn't replicate. The mathematics of aerial warfare had been rewritten in aluminum and high-octane gasoline, and Germany was drowning in the new arithmetic.